Go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Good afternoon. My name is Danielle Brooks, and I am the Director of Learning and Impact at CNE. Supporting me today with our behind the scenes, all things tech, is the amazingly talented Denisha Phipps, who is my colleague, and she is CNE's Membership and Programs Coordinator. We thank you so much for taking time out of the middle of your day to join us. And while we are getting started, we love building community with our CNE members. So hopefully we'll be able to get our chat going. But nonetheless, we're excited to welcome you to our learning series today. If this is your first time, we thank you for taking the time. If you have joined us for our other series that started off last year, welcome back. We thank you so much for continuing to grow with us as we introduce CNE's 7 actionable principles for a strong social sector. Today's topic, talent justice, is aligned with Principle 5, which is develop leaders. And in this webinar, as you noted in your registration, we'll be learning about how to invest in leaders in your organization with a lens on equity and strategies about fundraising and budgeting for competitive staff compensation and professional development, among other things. So you may be asking, what exactly are these 7 actionable principles? And I'm so glad you asked. The 7 actionable principles for a strong social sector framework and the companion resources are designed to build capacity within and bridge understanding between nonprofits and funders to strengthen the social sector and deepen our impact and service to the community. We encourage you to learn more by going to visit our website, and we will be adding those links throughout the webinar today. I also want to encourage you to use the Q&A function. Hopefully that is functioning as it should. Use the Q&A function to drop your questions as you are listening to our wonderful speaker today, or anything that you came in wanting to learn. I do appreciate all of you that took the time out to let us know in your registration what you were hoping to learn, and we'll be making sure and following along to see that those questions or concerns are addressed, and ensuring that we have those timely conversations about what you came here for. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that CNE's Charlottesville office is located on the ancestral home of the Monacan Indian Nation. We like to pause and honor those native lands that we are so, fortunate to be able to stand upon, but also to bring awareness to the peoples that were here before us. And you will see that there is a link you can follow to learn more about the Monacan Nation, as well as searching to find out the ancestral lands of all kinds of locations around the world. And so now, the reason why we're all here, I cannot hardly contain my excitement about our speaker. We are so fortunate to be joined by Rusty Stahl. He is the founder, president, and CEO of Fund the People. And any of you who've been around CNE for a while, we love Fund the People. We reference them quite a bit in a lot of our resource materials. He launched the organization in 2014 with the support of the Kresge Foundation. In this capacity, Rusty stewards Fund the People's vision and mission, generates financial investments and organizational partnerships, supports the advisory council, manages staff and consultants, and guides the development of programs and products. Rusty holds an MA in philanthropic studies from Indiana University, where he studied with Robert L. Payton in the prestigious Jane Addams Fellowship. He completed his undergraduate degree at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Rusty has served on several nonprofit boards, including that of the Jews for Racial and Economic Justice and Idealist.org. He has also served on advisory committees for the Council on Foundations, Independent Sector, Indiana University, Grand Valley State University, and the Nonprofit Workforce Coalition. I am excited, and at this time, I want to welcome him. Rusty, take it away.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for that introduction. Thrilled to be here. Thank you to CNE for using the materials we put out there on the web for the sector, and for inviting me here today to join you all. And as Daniel said, thanks for taking time to be here. Hoping to make this an engaging session and a valuable session for you all. Pardon me. I'm going to share my screen here and see how that works. Let's see. And yeah, so I have a slide presentation for you all, and I will be stopping at different points throughout to pause to see if folks have reflections, questions, thoughts as we go at a few different points. And I know Danielle and her colleagues will be kind of monitoring if you put things in the Q&A or the chat. I'm not sure if the chat is working at this point, but definitely I believe the Q&A is working, so please do use that. To give you the agenda for my presentation, first I'm going to share our Funding That Works framework, which is a relatively new framing that we're offering, and I think it complements the 7 actionable principles that CNE has produced, but offers you a set of a new framing of the problem facing our sector, a proposal for how to address it, and a set of guiding principles and other resources. After that, I'm going to dive into one of our guiding principles, which is about talent justice, as Danielle mentioned earlier, that term. And I'm going to share with you some of the findings of some research we've done around intersectional racial equity in the nonprofit workforce and talent justice. And then we'll have, actually, I'll talk a little bit after that about some more ways you can take action at your nonprofit, and then we'll go into the discussion. I'm hoping that you'll leave with some new framing and mental model, as I said, about the problem and our proposed solution. I hope you'll leave with an understanding of why intersectional racial equity is central to addressing the challenge facing our sector and our workforce. And third, I hope you'll leave with a concept of how to get going and where to gain some further resources. I can't promise you I will solve all of the problems of the sector and all of the problems of your particular organization today, and I can't give you all the information I'd like to share, but I can point you to where to get more from us or others. So just to give you a little taste about Fund the People, our vision is of an equitable, effective, and enduring nonprofit workforce with the ability to bring about meaningful social change and sustaining that social change for the long haul. Our mission is to maximize investment in the nonprofit workforce. And we do that primarily through a 3-part strategy. We make the case, we equip for action, and we strive to build a movement for talent investing in the social sector. Our big, hairy, audacious goal is that by 2033, we will have helped, along with groups like CNE, to drive widespread adoption of talent investing among funders as well as nonprofits across the United States. And that is, by the way, that's a picture of our one of the in-person convenings of our advisory council and staff and consultants. I think that's from 2016 or 2017. So we've been developing ideas, language, research, and tools since 2014. In 2017, we launched our online free toolkit, which has dozens of original pieces of content available to anyone on the web. And in 2019, we published our talent justice research. In 2020, we started our podcast. And all through that time, we've been developing these layers and layers of kind of ideas and tools. So our Funding That Works framework is an attempt we're making in 2022 to bring all of those pieces together into something comprehensive. And so I'm going to give you an introduction to that framework today. The name of the framework, Funding That Works, comes from this idea that we in the nonprofit sector need funding that works for the people who do the work in our organizations. So our framework is built around these 4 P's: potential, problem, proposal, and principles. The potential of our nonprofit workforce is great. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but you may or may not know that over 12 million Americans work in nonprofits, paid work. That's not including volunteers and board members. The nonprofit workforce is 10% of our private sector workforce. And the nonprofit sector is actually America's 3rd largest employer when you aggregate the sector together. Of course, that includes universities and hospitals and things like that. Moreover, the nonprofit workforce is a force for good in American communities, in our democracy, in our government, and in our economy. So we often tend to think about, our organizations, our causes in silos. And we talk about leadership. We often talk about just, individuals in positional leadership. But we at Fund the People like to talk about this workforce because it is vast, it is important, and it's a critical resource for our nation and our states and our cities and communities. So what's the problem? The problem facing the nonprofit workforce has been framed generally in the sector in a way that I believe is incorrect. The way it's been framed has often been that there is a deficit of leadership in the nonprofit sector and a deficit of leaders and potential leaders, right? So in about 2005, I think, a very influential consulting group called the Bridgespan Group published this research that was called The Nonprofit Sector's Leadership Deficit. And their message they intended to send was, hey, we've got to invest in the pipeline of leaders because the baby boomers are the biggest cohort in our demographically in our workforce. And they're at the top in the CEO and C-suite of nonprofits. They're going to retire soon at the traditional retirement age. And then there's not enough Gen Xers to fill their seats. And on top of that, there's more new nonprofits being formed all the time. So there's more seats to be filled. So that was kind of their assessment. And they were saying, hey, we've got to spend more money on things, including overhead, quote unquote overhead, or it'll be a dereliction of duty. But the narrative that stuck in the sector was not, hey, invest in the people we've got, but hey, we don't have enough people. We don't have enough leaders. We've got a deficit. We got to go elsewhere and find leaders to sort of fill these gaps. And so that became the kind of call to action. It's like, let's go to the business schools, or let's go outside of our sector and find people because we have this deficit. We've been reframing that problem to say, actually, the problem is a deficit of investment in our leaders, in our workforce. It's not just about the C-suite or the CEO or the charismatic leaders. And I know there are CEOs on this call, on this Zoom, and you're important, and I have that title too, for what it's worth. And, you know, it is a critical role, but it is not our entire workforce. And every CEO knows they can't get their job done without a team of people around them, everybody from the interns to the, you know, executive assistant and the board. So it's a team effort. And so we need to look at that way. So what we've been saying, the problem is that there's a bottleneck on the nonprofit career and leadership highway, that there is inequitable awareness, access, advancement, ascension, and after work. That these stages in nonprofit careers are inequitably structured. That many of those long-serving leaders that Bridgespan was talking about could not afford to retire at the traditional retirement age. Remember, the Great Recession hit soon after that report came out. And many of those folks didn't have a nest egg before the Great Recession because nonprofits aren't paying retirement savings, aren't offering retirement savings accounts and incentives. Too many of them are not. And so there's also the challenge of, what do I do after work, after I retire? How do I create a meaningful retirement when I'm so committed to my mission and building my organization? So those and other reasons, people don't retire at the traditional retirement age. And so, for better or worse, right? Some people want to, some people don't want to. I'm not judging that. I'm not trying to accuse anyone of anything. I just think that that's been the situation. And so a lot of folks behind those CEOs had no place to go. They were stuck in traffic. So they couldn't ascend into those roles. They could, and people behind them couldn't advance. And so the people on the on-ramps coming out of school or transitioning into nonprofit careers had challenges getting onto this highway. And if we go back even further, we don't often as a sector do a good job of enabling young people to be aware that they can make a living, a decent living, and make a contribution to their communities through nonprofit careers. So that's the bottleneck. Now that sometimes gets into stereotypes of different generations. Millennials want to move too fast. Gen Xers don't want to move up. Baby boomers won't move out of the way. We have all these kind of stereotypes of each other. But the truth is that this bottleneck is not just about personalities or bad drivers. It's a structural issue. If the bottleneck happens every day, it's not the fault of any one driver. It's the highway itself. The highway is poorly maintained. There's no shoulder to get off when folks need rest or a sabbatical to renew themselves. And we've seen more and more of those issues in recent years. People have to switch lanes to move up because the traffic isn't moving, and so on with my analogy that I love so much. Now, why is this happening? Why is this highway so poorly designed and maintained? Well, the problem beneath that highway is a chronic deficit of investment in the nonprofit workforce. On this chart, you can see that from 1992 to 2011, data from the Foundation Center showed that on average, there about 1% or less of grant dollars was going to investments in nonprofit staff development or leadership development. That's about a 20-year period. And I'm sure it goes back further and further. So this deficit of investment in the nonprofit workforce is what I want to help you, and I want you to help me address. That is the real problem confronting us. And so we've come up with this proposal to change the way the funding game is played so that we can begin to maximize investment in the nonprofit workforce and end that chronic deficit. So our proposal we call talent investing. The intentional deployment of capital to support and develop nonprofit leaders and workers. Now that intentional deployment of capital can come from government money, right? Government provides grants and contracts and tax benefits to the nonprofit sector. It can come from foundations and donors. So on the supply side of money, if you will, it can also come from the demand side, from the fundraising community, from the board members and CEOs and professional fundraisers and program staff represented on this Zoom call. So I wanted to share with you the 8 guiding principles we've come up with to undergird the idea of talent investing. And they're on your screen. So we want to, principle 1 is about treating nonprofit workers with respect and dignity, respecting the work, respecting the workers. Principle 2 is reframing who we are. We are not overhead to be minimized. We are bedrock, the bedrock of organizational effectiveness. Principle 3 is about addressing that chronic deficit, not just the symptoms that we see like turnover or burnout or the need for training. These are the things that funders tend to latch on to. And we tend to have get programmatic responses. Let's have a fellowship. Let's have a cohort. They tend to be outside of nonprofit budgets, outside of the structures in which we work. So we want to address the problem and help nonprofits to invest in their own staff, to have the resources to invest in their own staff, rather than trying to put out fires when they happen with kind of externalized resources. The 4th principle is that equity is essential. And we talk about intersectional racial equity because we believe that chronic deficit of investment in the nonprofit workforce is enabled by a set of myths and assumptions, like the overhead myth, that are imbued with racialized, gendered, and class assumptions. Things like, women can work for below market rates because their husbands work on Wall Street and can support them. Or things like people of color aren't good fundraisers because they don't have wealthy friends, or they're not wealthy themselves, so they can't schmooze and get to rich people and ask them for money successfully. So those are just 2 of the kind of myths and embedded assumptions that continue this deficit of investment. And that's why we need this intersectional approach to addressing equity, putting race front and center, but not exclusively, not forgetting things like gender, ability, geography, immigration status, age, socioeconomic status. The fifth principle is to take a supportive stance. Often, staff in a nonprofit may be hesitant to raise issues with their supervisors or their CEOs. They triangulate, they talk to others, they complain, but don't actually talk to the people who have the power to change it because they fear some kind of punishment. Similarly, CEOs of nonprofits may not talk to their boards or their funders about their staffing challenges because they fear repercussions. And so we need boards, we need CEOs, we need funders to take a supportive stance as they investigate what are the challenges facing the workforce in this organization. Is it the unpaid internships? Is it people don't have sabbaticals? Is it the lack of health insurance? What are people experiencing? Well, you're not going to get the truth if you don't show evidence that you're going to support people and not punish them for sharing, and that you're actually going to respond and address the issues that the concerns they have. So take a supportive stance. The sixth principle, it takes time and money. Okay, yes, you can get fixed quick fixes. And you can do things for free, right? So there's this concept that, the 80-20 rule, that, 20% of professional growth comes from, or some minority, I don't know if 20-80, it's some other formula somebody probably knows on this call, but right, that a minority of your professional growth comes from formal trainings, a majority of it comes from on-the-job stretch assignments. Stretch assignments may not cost money, and so those are important. But if you want to really effectively build an entire team, an entire workforce of an organization or set of organizations, it takes time and money, because time is money. So if you want to put someone on a stretch assignment, who's going to do the work they used to do? Right? It takes money, it takes time. And actually, research has shown from the for-profit sector that if you want to show your staff that you care about them and you're committed to their growth and sustainability, you actually need at least 3 interventions going on layered on top of each other over a long period, both to prove your commitment to your staff, to build that loyalty and trust, but also to see actual changes, to see the results. And so it does take time and money. The 7th principle, be responsive to context. So, in one marketplace, one community, it may be that the demographics may be one way. So in the Bay Area of San Francisco, you may not be lacking for young people to come work in nonprofits. In another area in, I don't know, rural Louisiana, you may not have the same demographics and age group. So you may have more of an aging workforce. So the kinds of interventions you make are going to depend on that kind of context. In a legacy institution that's 100 years old, you may have different challenges than in a startup. In a 200-person staff, you're going to have a set of challenges that you might not have in a 3-person staff. So the deficit of investment is real in all those different contexts. The need to invest in talent is real. But the diagnoses, the way that the problem shows up may look very different. And so the specific interventions will need to be different. One thing I want to say on this principle is that folks participating in this webinar may not, there are people who are listed as other staff in the registration. That's cool. Like, you don't have to be the CEO or executive director of a nonprofit to make these investments or make these changes, right? So wherever you stand, whatever context your role is, you can do talent investing one way or another. And if you can't do it today at this organization, you can do it next year as your role and power and authority grows, or maybe in some future role you have somewhere else. The eighth principle is to lift up the value of talent investing. There's too little data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, that's widely available in our sector about the value of investing in staff. And that lack of data and lack of stories becomes an excuse for funders or others not to take action. So we've got to do talent investing, but as much as possible, document the value of it with it, whether that's on social media, blogs, videos, formal evaluations, whatever kind of dog and pony show you could put on to show the value of investing in staff, it's worth it. So those are the 8 guiding principles of talent investing I wanted to share. There's more to our Funding That Works framework. There's practices, and I'm going to share a little later on in the presentation the idea of talent-focused fundraising and some practical ways you can begin to engage with funders around your staffing needs. So just to give you a foreshadow that that is coming. But at this point, I just want to pause and invite folks to open your mic, raise your hand, put things in the Q&A or the chat, whatever feels good to you. I'd love to have, if somebody wants to come on camera and come on mic, share any questions, thoughts, reflections. Is this resonating? Am I off base? So I'll pause here to invite your thoughts. And I can't really see the Q&A or anything, so if the folks from C&E can help me out.
Yeah, as of this moment, there is nothing in our Q&A.
All right.
Oh no, I take that back. We just got a question as I was saying that. I 100% agree about the lack of upward mobility in nonprofits. Many are small and people get stuck in low-level roles for years.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, right? So again, funders tend to focus on the charismatic external CEOs as the leaders who need to be developed. But in my experience, a lot of the wealth of talent is buried in organizations in the junior staff, the emerging staff, the younger staff. Not to say that older folks don't have a lot of talent too, but there's just a lot of people in our sector who do not get those opportunities to get out, to network, to be visible in the, in the field. And those might be accountants, they might be program people, they might be fundraisers, they might be administrative. It doesn't matter. And there are lots of ways to support those folks that are beneficial to everyone. And including just enabling them to spend time networking in their professional associations outside the organization. Even giving people a new title, even if their responsibilities stay not that changed, but ways like that signal we respect you, we care about you, we want to see you grow and develop. And so yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, along the lines of that comment, and I was with a group in a different part of our state last week, and I was very surprised about just still the mindset around of overhead. And this was with, some of our nonprofit leaders in an HR kind of workshop. So I wonder, when I think about our smaller nonprofits that are trying to take this in, and I'm sure you'll get to it maybe as we talk about fundraising, is there a way, like key words or key seeds that people can begin to plant to begin um, just moving in the direction of these conversations that you would suggest, where there may just be, a lot of barriers, right, before we can really start moving major needles? Can you talk about that a little bit? Uh-oh, I've lost your sound, Rusty. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I turned off my microphone. I'm sorry while you were talking. Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that additional thought, Danielle. What I was saying, and I was starting to get on my soapbox, so I'll try to get the energy back from my silent soapbox, is that overhead's a myth. Overhead's a made up concept. It didn't come from God. It didn't come from Jesus. It didn't come from Moses. It didn't come from the Bible. It didn't come from the Constitution. It didn't come from the tax code. It came from some accountant somewhere, or some, at this point, you can either have an all volunteer social sector with organizations that have no capacity from a staff perspective, or you can have a professionally run social sector that is, productive and effective and can deliver services and programs on behalf of philanthropic supporters and government and the boards. And you can't have both. You can't have it both ways. And so this idea that nonprofit employees who are not spending 50 or 70% of their time specifically on programs are some kind of overhead is such a useless and harmful idea at this point, and it's been debunked. Number of years ago, the Guide Star, Charity Navigator, and the Foundation Center all came out with an open letter to America's donors about the overhead myth, to try to persuade funders that overhead was not a good measure of organizational effectiveness, that low overhead was not a good, and that overhead was not a useful concept. Then they came out with a similar open letter to America's nonprofits saying the same thing. We've got to stop using this concept. I'm happy to send those along, or you can Google them. Unfortunately, the website they were on is no longer up, but I can make sure you get them. And more recently, a group of financial consultants called Financial Management Associates, FMA, did a study with a dozen of the biggest foundations in the country. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, Ford Foundation, these big national and international funders. And they looked at what's the overhead rate you make available in your grants, and what's the actual overhead of your grantees. They looked at the 990 forms. And they found, for example, that with one of those big foundations, they were restricting their overhead in grants to 15%. But the average overhead of their most healthy grantees was 30%. So the foundation actually ended up increasing their overhead rate from 15 to 30%.
Wow.
Now, that's a great success, but why didn't they go further? That was the average. So, these funders can be, and I love philanthropy, but it's important to say, that is a very conservative and overly cautious approach to change. So I think we need to flip the whole funding formula. If you're given, 20% of every grant can be for overhead, and the other 80% has to go to a program. I want funders to flip that. 80% should be going to paying for staff support and development, and operational excellence. And 20% can go to pay for flyers, muffins, Zoom accounts. That's program expenses. And that's what nonprofit budgets are really like. So I'm actually writing a blog post now that's going to come out hopefully today or tomorrow, called Flip the Funding Formula, that makes that case. See, Allison, so many foundations and government grants continue to rely on this overhead myth during the grant making decisions. Additionally, this ridiculous restrictions and match requirements limit us so much. Yes, exactly. You know, the funders are still doing it, and it forces nonprofits to play this game and bury overhead, quote unquote overhead costs in program line items. And it's really a sick and damaging game. So, you know, it's incumbent on all of us to help turn that around, help change every funder, educate them about why this is not a useful practice. All right, I'm going to move us into the next portion because it's very important. And that is specifically digging into that principle 4, talent justice is essential. So Fund the People in 2018 partnered with the Center for Urban and Racial Equity, or CURE, which is a consulting practice out of Washington, D.C. and Florida, run by Dr. Judy Lubin. And together, CURE and Fund the People did this talent justice study. We surveyed over 1,000 funders, nonprofits, and consultants who work with funders and nonprofits, people of color, white people. We did 3 focus groups and a couple dozen interviews with survey participants. And we studied the challenges, opportunities, and practices for investing in intersectional racial equity in nonprofit careers. And I wanted to share a few of the key findings from our study. We published in 2019, and here's a few of the findings. First, people of color experience systemic inequities when pursuing nonprofit work. So in bold here on this chart, the blue stripes are white people, the whatever you would call that, gold stripes are people of color, and the boldened words on the left have statistically significant differences. So you can see that I lacked connections. There's about an 11% difference between people of color at 29% and whites at 40%. There was no recruiting in my community. 17% people of color, 28% white people. I'm sorry, 17% of whites said there was no recruiting in my community. 28% said of people of color said there was no recruiting in my community. Opportunities like AmeriCorps were underpaid. More people of color there. I lacked skills or experience. Now that finding I think is an interesting one and a challenging one, because the Building Movement Project and their Race to Lead surveys of the sector, which are much bigger than ours was, and they've done them 2 times now, found that people of color and whites who are equally experienced and credentialed are still experiencing differences in how they are able to move up in the field. So I don't know if that's a self-perception or what, but I think that finding has actually been challenged by the Race to Lead study. You can see at the bottom there, I did not meet the degree requirements. Now that may connect to that issue of lacking in skills or experience, but obviously having master's level degrees or more has become more important in the nonprofit sector in terms of professional development and growth. And that costs a lot of money that some people don't have, or a lot more people are taking on debt, which school debt, which is good debt to have if you have to have debt, but it's still debt. and it makes it more challenging to do things like save for retirement. So people of color experience systemic inequities when pursuing nonprofit work. That was just findings from our access level. We looked at access, advancement, and ascension in this study. So these findings range around from those three areas. Second finding I wanted to share with you, and I'm going to share, I think, 4 here. Second one is funders and nonprofits are making insufficient investments in supporting the nonprofit workforce equity, particularly at the access and advancement stages. So you can see here on the right, the red lines are needs that are reported, and then foundation investments are in the gold bar, and blue are nonprofit investments. So for example, competitive starting salaries and benefits, 84% of people said that was a big need, but 41% of our funder respondents said they were making investments in competitive starting and salaries and benefits for their grantees, and only 46% of the nonprofit respondents said they were making those kinds of investments, and so on and so on. The next finding I want to share: exclusionary organizational culture and wait and see funding practices hinder the leadership of new Americans. This was actually something I did not have on my radar screen going into the study, but we found statistically significant differences between people who were born outside of the United States but working here, and those born here. So we looked at this question of, do funders wait and see when a new leader has been installed as a CEO of a nonprofit? Do they wait and see if that person's going to be perceived as successful before they renew grants? So that's the wait and see approach. And you can see here that more than double the people born outside the United States experienced that wait and see approach than the people born in the country. And the people on the lower chart there, people born outside or people whose parents immigrated to the US, have more than double an experience of bias or discrimination in hiring and performance evaluation processes than those of us born in the US or US territories. So again, this is self-reporting. So this is real, this is perceived, this is both. The point is, this is people's experience, lived experience. Funders and nonprofits differ on how to promote equity in our workforce. So we split out the data of responses by consultants to nonprofits or funders. So that's the green line. Foundations, funders, which is the gold bar here, and nonprofits, the blue bar. And we found that the consultants and the funders tended to be closer to each other in their responses, but that there was these significant gaps between the nonprofit perspective and the funder perspective. So best ways to support equity: competitive salary increases. Half of the nonprofit respondents said yes. Only 32% of the funders said yes. And in similar gaps with mentorships, competitive benefits, and HR systems, where the nonprofits were less likely to say well-functioning HR systems were the solution, but the funders were more likely to say that. So here's some of the conclusions that our study came to: that consistent patterns of systemic exclusion inhibit the careers of people of color, women, immigrants, and young professionals. And there's other findings about women and young professionals in the study that I didn't pull out here. Across all stages of the career, the nonprofit career, people of color report experiencing more barriers. And last here, deficits in workforce equity are related to a general lack of investment in nonprofit talent that has compounding impacts on underrepresented groups. So I want to share a couple of the takeaways that I think about a lot in thinking about this study and its findings. And I should remind you, this data is from 2018, 2019, before the pandemic, before the murder of George Floyd, before everything that's happened in our country since then. First is that we need a hell of a lot more listening and dialogue across lines of power and difference. We found there were different responses about the problem and the solution between funders and nonprofits, and between white people and people of color. And so we need to find ways to listen more to each other. And whether we believe each other or not, it doesn't really matter. We need to actually be empathetically and actively listening to understand each other's perspectives about what's happening. And secondly, there is no talent justice without talent investing. We talk a lot these days in the sector about DEI and equity. But if we're not talking about salaries, we're not talking about benefits, we're not talking about HR issues and systems, it's going to be hard to get to talent justice. And there's no talent investing without talent justice, that we have to bring that intersectional racial equity lens when we think about salaries, compensation, benefits, and all those staffing things. So those are my takeaways I wanted to share. You can read more at talentjustice.org, which is a section of our overall website. You can find our full report with all the findings and the methodology. You can find an executive summary. And there's also a toolkit, which is one PDF with 10 different tools in it. There's also infographics and a webinar recording with Dr. Lubin sharing the results of the study. So I just want to point you to that. There's really a lot more there. So I want to pause here for thoughts from folks. Any comments, quick comments, reflections? I think the lack skills or experience may be the result of imposter syndrome. Yeah, that is. And so many foundations and government grants continue. We'd already talked about that one. Okay. All right, so I think we're almost at time here. Am I right, Danielle?
We're coming up. We set aside time for some Q&A. We wanted to make sure we had an opportunity for people to have real interaction with you in real time. I did want to ask, again, because we have many, smaller organizations that are joining us, if you could, sum up, like, I'd like to have like one action step, one takeaway that maybe people can walk away with, particularly where, again, there may be many challenges. Where would you suggest that one start on this path?
So let me do my last little part here, and I think that may help give some actionable resources. So within talent investing, we've come up with this term of talent-focused fundraising. That is resource mobilization that proudly leads with the value of your staff and the value of supporting and developing staff, rather than burying the needs of the staff and the strengths of the staff like we bury our overhead costs in program line items. So the idea here, if I can get these things to go forward, is to taking into consideration both the talent investing principles and the talent justice conversation we've had, and blending those, town focused fundraising looks at starting from a strength-based place. So trying to understand the assets of your team. So not just coming in from what are the deficits, but what are the strengths? What makes this place tick? What are we bringing to the table that makes us great? But also striving to understand those staffing needs, those problems, those deficits. What is that weak underbelly that we all have in our organizations that we need to understand better so that we can begin to address it? So an action step in this regard could be to do an anonymous survey of your team and really try to make it anonymous and let the board take it, let the CEO take it, let everybody take it, including the unpaid interns or whoever, to really understand what are the strengths of the staff, what are the weaknesses, what are their perceptions around racial equity in the organization, what are their perceptions around compensation, benefits, are they 1 foot out the door, what do they think about management? All of those things. Like, I think it's important to be brutally harsh, right? You just try to get the truth out of people. And the best way to do it, I think, is to be as anonymous as possible. If you can bring in a consultant or CNE to facilitate this, right? If people don't want to write stuff down, do it as interviews with a consultant who's not going to shit, where it is fully anonymized, right? So people can really pour their hearts out. Now, I'm not saying you're going to find lots of problems, but you might. And if you're an executive director on this call, you may not be getting the truth from your team, or you may not be giving the truth to the board about your own experience. So I think it's important as a baseline to collect that data. That's going to give you a much stronger place to stand to then try to address those issues. Otherwise, you're flying blind. So trying to understand the staff's strengths and needs in a way that gives them that safety to share that. And then it's about going to all your funders. I'm sorry, before I talk about that, actually, to be strength-based, I recommend including staff investments in your strategic plan, making it one of the pillars of your plan that supports the other pillars, and that you lift that up as a value to become a great place to work, or however you want to phrase it. And so if that becomes one of your guiding principles, your guiding goals of whatever your guiding document is, if it's a strategic plan or a framework or a roadmap, whatever it is. Now, it may be a struggle to get the board on board with that, but I think that's the work. So once you can get it into your guiding document, your roadmap, then you can translate that into your budget, because that's how the rubber hits the road from a strategic plan, translating implementation into your budget. So now that means, okay, how are we thinking about compensation? How are we thinking about benefits? Do we have an HR staff person who can support our team? If not, if we're too small, can we outsource some kind of HR function? And there are consultants out there, and I will send Danielle a list of them that your nonprofit can use to outsource your HR functions or other staff-related functions. Those things cost money, and so they need to be in the budget. So if you can put them into a budget, even if it's theoretical, you don't have the money yet for this budget, even if it's next year and you're going to grow it over 5 years, start getting it into the budget. So now that you understand the needs and the strengths, you've made it a part of your strategic plan, and you've got it in your budget, now you can go to your funders and say, well, I'm not coming to you from a place of weakness. I may be opening up a strategic area of vulnerability to say, you know what, we are understaffed given our ambitious goals to address hunger in our community, and your goal to address hunger in our community through our work. And so we appreciate you investing in our programs and our organization. We need you to invest in our staff team as a part of that, because that's part of our budget, as part of our strategy, as part of our culture, organizational culture, and as part of how we're going to accomplish addressing hunger in this community. And so that is that area of using your vulnerability for strategic purposes. Funders don't want to hear everything's perfect because they can sniff out BS. They actually want their money to go help you solve problems in your organization. That feels great to them. So if you can get your funders mobilized as a champion for addressing this issue, the deficit of investment in your nonprofit workforce, in your organization, you've just shifted the power from you're following the money to the money is following you. And you've just started to address that overhead issue that we talked about extensively earlier. Then you can cultivate your funders not only as champions for your staff, but for your organization and for the staff of other organizations. So starting to shift the narrative in the sector, you have a lot of power to do that as a fundraiser by sharing this with funders, because funders have a blind spot for this issue. They never hear about it from their grantees. They never hear, you know what, we're understaffed. You know what, we're underpaying people. You know what, we don't offer retirement matching. You know what, we're not providing health insurance, so our people get sick and we're not giving them that safety net as an employer. They don't hear that stuff. And so when they don't hear that, they think it's okay to keep funding the way things are. So by playing the game the way it's structured, we artificially lower the demand for this, which keeps the supply of talent investment from foundations low. So you can help in these very practical ways to change that dynamic. I hope that's helpful. I know it's not easy. It's not a quick fix per se, but I hope it's helpful and practical.
No, it really is very helpful, and this work is not easy, but I do appreciate some of the findings, and the statistics were pretty astounding. So I think that in and of itself gives us a lot to think about and draw from. And I'm thinking that some of the materials that you referenced, and that I know, we have linked to, have some different case studies as well that, people can take a look at and to begin to have these conversations. But I love the idea of the survey, of everyone in the organization and getting that raw data just as a starting point around, staff strengths and then what they need to be successful. I think that we do have great opportunity in our sector to do more of that and to really unleash the power of the people, as cliche as that sounds. But I'm a firm believer in we need the people to do our mission. And so we have to make that investment. Well, I am so excited. I'm very energized by this talk, and not seeing any questions in our Q&A. We will begin our wrap up. So if there are any burning questions, or even if folks want to come off mute or off onto their camera and have a dialogue as we are closing out. There will be a survey in the chat. I believe Denisha's putting a link to a survey in the chat. We'd love to hear from you about this info session. We have a couple more planned as we are wrapping up this intro to our 7 Actionable Principle series. We'd love to invite you to come to our website to also look at how we might introduce 7AP into your organization by way of a consult or technical assistance. We'd love to continue the conversation under develop leaders or any of the other principles that are listed there. Also, continue to check out our website for upcoming training. We have several training opportunities that are taking place between now and the end of the year. And it would not be a day at CNE if I did not give a plug for Philanthropy Day that we have coming up on November 17th. For those of you in the Charlottesville area, that will be an in-person event at the Wool Factory. And we are super excited about we have 2 speakers and a new location, and looking at a healthier democracy and what that means for us in the social sector. Again, we thank you so much for joining us. We are hoping to continue to build this community of practice around 7 actionable principles. So we welcome your feedback. I hear someone off mute. Is there a question, comment that somebody has? I want to make room for that before we close out the session today. Okay. Well, hearing none, we appreciate your feedback in our survey and look forward to a follow-up email with the slides, materials that Rusty mentioned that he would forward to us. We will also have a recording of this webinar that you're able to share with others who may not have been able to make it in your organization. And, you can play it for your board and they could hear the words from somebody else. It's always effective to have somebody else amplify those challenging messages when you're trying to move the needle on hard topics. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care, everybody.